One of the questions I get asked a lot is, I've noticed X, Y, and Z in my child. Should I get them assessed for autism? Do you think it could be autism? What do I do next? And my answer is almost always the exact same. And I'm going to share with you what that answer is. But first, I want to explain a few things. If we've not met before, hi, I am Ree from mummyof4.com. I have 4 wonderful children, all of which over the years have been diagnosed with autism. So I've got a fair amount of experience with dealing with autism, the assessment process, the objections that you get both as a parent from other people that you face when going through this rather intense and stressful process. So I'm going to share all of that with you in this video and hopefully answer your question whether you should start the process to get your child assessed or not. Approximately 1 in 100 children at the moment in the UK have a diagnosis of autism, and I'm going to hazard a guess that the number of children on the waiting list is a lot higher than that, and the number of children who are not yet even flagged as potentially having autism because they are high functioning, managing, or just shy, quiet, quirky, is going to put that number up a lot higher if we were to actually be able to figure out how many children actually have autism. 1 in 100 is just not even going to touch it. It's going to be a lot higher than that. So in this video, we're going to discuss the signs of autism, whether it's worth having an assessment, even if you think your child might have autism but seem to be coping. What are the benefits of being assessed? What are the downsides of being assessed? So you can just have a bit more information. So a lot of this might be super overwhelming to take in, and trying to learn all of the different signs and symptoms of autism can be a lot to process. So I have put together a PDF which will be super helpful for you if you're going through this process. I know it's the kind of thing that I wish someone had given me back when my children were first being assessed. This resource would have made my life so much easier. So this is a printable with covering 100 different signs that could indicate that your children have autism. It's not a medical document. It's more of something that's designed to start discussions, to help you think, well, actually, am I seeing signs here? And to highlight a lot of the signs which I didn't realise till way down the journey. Some of these signs I didn't even notice till after my 2nd or 3rd child was diagnosed that are actually signs of autism. So you can follow the link on screen. I'll also put it down in the description. That will take you to a page where you can pop in your email address and I will send you this document. And that resource will be a good place for you to note down all the different things that you're noticing in your child, and indeed things you're not noticing in your child. So when it comes to talking to the school, health professionals, you can feel equipped and ready to have those conversations and not blindsided by questions you just, quite frankly, weren't expecting. Asking about symptoms you didn't even know were relevant, you should have been looking out for, because that's how I felt. It made me feel like a rubbish mum. It made me feel unprepared, and I don't want you to feel like that, okay? So this does seem as good a time as any to just do a quick internet disclaimer that we always have to do. I am not a doctor. I am a mum of children with autism, but I am not a medical health professional, so please seek help from your own medical health professionals at all times. And the printable, helpful as it is and handy as it is not going to tell you whether your child does or does not have autism. It's not a medical document. Only an actual assessment can tell you if your child has autism or does not have autism. Just keep that in mind, that these things are tools and information. Only that actual assessment can give you the actual answer. Okay, with all of that said, taking it back to the very beginning, as Maria from The Sound of Music says, let's start at the very beginning.
A very good place to start.
If you're brand new to all of this, you might wonder, well, actually, what is autism? Autism is described by the NHS as a lifelong developmental disability that affects how individuals interact and communicate with the world around them, characterised by difficulties in social interaction, social communication, and often includes repetitive or restrictive behaviours. Now, autism is a spectrum, so if you've just met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and another person with autism could be absolutely nothing like them and have totally different challenges. Some individuals require little to no support, while others require daily or even constant assistance. So it presents differently in every individual. So why and when should you consider getting your child assessed? Inside this download, there's a lot more detailed information, but we're just going to touch on in this video some things that you may notice that may indicate your child needs an assessment. Things such as limited eye contact, difficulty understanding social cues, difficulty understanding when people don't mean exactly what they mean. So things like sarcasm, or when people aren't specific in their words. A lot of human communication is non-verbal, and sometimes people with autism can struggle to pick up on these other bits that we do that go alongside our words to support what we're saying. So if you notice your child not being able to pick up on these types of social cues the way that other children their age would, it could indicate they need an assessment. Have a look out for repetitive behaviours which can be known as stimming, such as rocking, hand flapping. Some of these very fidgety repetitive behaviours could also indicate ADHD, which is a whole other story and a whole other video. But ultimately, they all kind of fall under the same spectrum of neurodiversity. And any of these things that you notice, note them down. Print out that printable, jot down all of the things you do and do not notice, and then you're just armed with that information. Because take it from me, it's so difficult when you're in a room faced with a couple of health professionals or professionals from the education system that you don't know. It can feel like a high pressure situation. And sometimes it's just really hard to recall the information if you've not got it all noted down there in front of you. And you don't want to leave the room thinking, oh, I should have said this, should have said that. There's nothing more frustrating. Another sign of autism can be strict reliance on routine and getting very, very upset when routine is disrupted. And this can even be for things that are considered to be treats or pleasant things. So, for example, if you have a child with autism and there is a fun dress-up day in school, they could get really, really stressed out and worried and concerned leading up to that dress-up day, even though from the teacher's point of view, it's something fun and an excellent break from maths. Won't the children be pleased? For children with autism, that interruption to the routine can really, really impact them. Another thing that you may notice if your child does have autism is that they have meltdowns. These meltdowns can often be misinterpreted by, say, strangers in supermarkets or elderly relatives as tantrums. And I think the big difference for me that I've noticed as a parent between a meltdown and a tantrum would be if a child was having a tantrum and you said, no, you can't have sweets, no, you can't have sweets. And then you decided, I wouldn't recommend this, to go, fine, here you go, here are the sweets. The child having the tantrum would instantly stop. They'd be like, right, I've got what I wanted. The behaviour has demanded the thing I wanted. I've got what I wanted, so I'm going to stop screaming and shouting. If a child is having a meltdown, it's almost like, even if you say, fine, we'll go back and we'll give you what you wanted, or we'll fix the thing that's needed fixing, whatever caused the meltdown, we can undo it. It's like that's gone too far and they can't just flip a switch and feel in that normal, safe and social state. They can't regulate themselves as easily and as quickly as a neurotypical child could because the meltdown has gone too far. So if you notice that disruptions in routine really impact your child, this could be something worth discussing with your health professional or school. So we've covered a few of the things, and this is just very, very brief. Let me know if you want a much more in-depth video on specific signs and symptoms of autism, and I will put that together for you. But if you've noticed some of the signs, or you've noticed a lot of the signs perhaps in this 100 Signs of Autism PDF, still, why would you bother to seek an assessment? What's the benefit? So the biggest one for me is I have noticed that the earlier you get the intervention, the more beneficial it appears to be. If you take my second child, who's my youngest son, so I've got 2 boys and then 2 girls, but baby number 2 was my first child to be assessed and diagnosed. And honestly, I used to worry about him so much, and he won't mind me saying this because I talked to him about it and it's something he kind of giggles at now. But when he was little, specifically age around 3 and younger, he was so incredibly challenging. He was, a gorgeous, wonderful, very intelligent child, but he was only happy if his routine was exact. He was only happy if the food that was presented to him was exactly what he was expecting. He had such a very balanced and healthy diet, because that's what I fed him, but such a rigid diet, to the point where we went on a touring caravan holiday to Europe and I had to take pre-made meals that I'd made here in the UK with me, because we could not buy something in a restaurant to feed him. I had to take a meal and ask them to heat it up, because if it didn't look and smell and be the exact meal, not even similar to it, if it wasn't the exact meal, the exact texture, he'd know and he would not eat it. So he was incredibly rigid. He could read, and this is another thing to kind of look out for with autism, what they refer to as spiky development, where your child is perhaps very advanced in some areas but struggles a lot in other areas. So rather than having like the sort of similar scores across the board with how well they're performing and developing, to be kind of very advanced in some areas and struggling in others. So he could read, by age 3, he could read fluently. And I'm talking by his 3rd birthday. He could break into the parent password areas of apps. I think he had like a Winnie the Pooh app, and you had to be able to read the numbers and type them in order to access this sort of settings area, and he could do that. He thought it was very funny he could do that. Okay, try again. Which one did that say? What did that one say?
5.
But then he wouldn't speak to anybody. He would communicate with me in that I understood everything he needed and gave him everything he needed, but no one else could really understand him. He could talk, he had no problems with speech, but he didn't really want to talk to anyone. It's like, oh no, I don't actually wish to speak to you. He wouldn't keep his shoes on anywhere, like anywhere at all. And I was so worried when he started school that he just wouldn't be able to integrate. And all I ever really wanted for him was to just be able to go to school and hang out with his friends and be able to just fit in, I guess, and just enjoy life without things like rigid eating and refusal to keep shoes on indoors. I'm talking even if we went to the post office here, kind of becoming problematic as he got older. Now, as soon as Will started school, the term after he turned 3, I had an amazing relationship with his school teacher. He was assessed and diagnosed shortly afterwards. So much was put in place. We were supporting him at home. We had this excellent relationship with the school. He had speech and language therapy. Not that he couldn't speak and didn't have good language because he could read, but it was his understanding of language that he struggled with and knowing how to use it. We used strategies with him, strategies that I can make another video about if that would be helpful, but we used so many strategies with him both at home and in school that honestly, if you met Will now, or if you've seen him in the Disney vlogs, if you've watched vlogs on my Disney channel, then you'll see him there. I call him Willopedia because it's absolutely full of facts. And he just is such a happy child. He's in mainstream school. He is just the absolute poster child for early intervention. We had a meeting at the end of year 7, and the Senko Special Educational Needs Coordinator said just how thrilled they were with him, with his progress, that he's just fit into the school so well. He's just happy and being able to take mainstream school in his stride and enjoy it. And I just don't feel that this would have been the case if we hadn't had that early intervention. If I'd done what was so tempted to do and just be like, oh, he's more able and talented, just gifted, just quirky, just quiet, just anything. If I had not pushed as hard as I had and had him assessed, I know we wouldn't have had that help. And I don't believe he'd be thriving the way that he is now. It's not to say he has no challenges at all, but honestly, poster child for an early intervention. So one of the reasons to potentially get your child assessed for autism is because if they do need help, which you're only going to know once they've been assessed, if they need the help or not, they're going to need that help sooner rather than later. And with the amount of time that any child is going to spend on a waiting list in the UK currently, the earlier you get your name on the list, the earlier you're going to get assessed, and therefore the earlier you're going to be able to access help for your child. Another reason is a formal diagnosis will give you access to more resources. Now, it's not to say that you can't have things in place in children's schools without a diagnosis, because you absolutely can, but there are certain things that you may need a formal diagnosis to access. For example, potentially when your child gets to be a teenager, maybe they would need extra time in exams or to do exams in a quieter setting. I know exams are supposed to be quiet, but rather than like the big exam hall, maybe they would prefer to do exams in a separate, quieter, just a smaller space. And if you've got a formal diagnosis for your child and that's what they need, then you're more likely to be able to access those kind of resources. Children with autism often, and adults with autism as well for that matter, often struggle with queuing, for example, and you are going to need a formal diagnosis if you want to be able to apply for something like a ride access pass or a disability pass, something like that, to access things where there is a queuing system specifically for people with autism to avoid having to stand in long queues that just are not manageable if you want to do things like theme park days. There may be additional support that your child will be able to get in school, depending on their diagnosis, depending where you live, potentially there's funding available for your child or for the school. But whichever resource your child specifically will need, which is obviously going to vary depending on the child, because autism is a spectrum and everyone needs something different. But often without a formal diagnosis, some of these resources will not be options for you. I think the biggest one for me, the biggest reason that I wanted to get my children assessed, and ultimately the same reason that I ended up having an assessment for ADHD for myself, which turns out I have. I was diagnosed earlier this year at age 40 with ADHD, so that's a whole different story. But one of the main reasons for these assessments was just for understanding my children, and then in the case of my ADHD, understanding my own brain, and to stop second guessing myself. So when Will was waiting to be assessed, I had a chat on the phone with his consultant before we met with her. And I said, look, I'm really, really stuck with the fuss eating, which was resolved through lots of strategies. But at the time I said, look, I just need to know the answer here. He's so rigid. Do I just say, hey, look, this is what's for dinner, eat it, and if he's hungry enough, he'll eat it? Or should I just keep going as I'm going till I see, like, what should I do? I'm at the end of my tether. And she said, well, with a neurotypical child that doesn't have any other physical or mental health issues, they would not starve themselves. They would eventually eat, and that would be fine. However, with a child with autism, they may actually starve themselves rather than eat something they don't want. So absolutely do not do that strategy. That was the advice she gave me. And this is just a very small example of how by understanding your children, then you can parent them accordingly without thinking like, oh, am I doing this right? And it just took that element of second guessing myself out. And I feel really guilty actually, which I shouldn't, because I didn't know any better. And I actually have had conversations with our eldest and apologised, but I feel really guilty that he wasn't assessed until he was in his late teens, and he didn't have that understanding from me. I was doing my best, but I didn't know anything really compared to what I know now about autism, and I certainly didn't understand high functioning autism. I thought back then that autism meant, no speech at all, and all of my children had speech and most of them were quite chatty. With my limited understanding back then, there's no way that I ever would have put our eldest forward for an assessment. But I feel super guilty that I didn't, because he could have had so much more understanding. I could have offered him so much more help, and he struggled so much more than he needed to in so many situations because he didn't have that support and understanding from me, from the school, from everybody. I've had multiple lengthy conversations with him and apologised profusely for sort of, feeling like I'd failed him by not understanding and getting assessed younger. He's like, Mum, you didn't know. It's absolutely fine. I'm so not cross with you, which is very nice to hear. But I did feel like I owed him that apology. I just know that so many of the struggles he faced, he wouldn't have faced if he'd had earlier interventions. So I know so many of those struggles that he faced, he wouldn't have faced if he'd had both that early intervention and that understanding from me, the rest of the family, and the school. Some parents worry about labelling their children, and I hear this so much about, I don't need a label, I don't want a label. This concern was huge when I was younger, when I was in school, which was quite some time ago. I know lots of people didn't want the label of being dyslexic or the other things that were more commonly diagnosed back then. Autism was definitely not so common, as most people with autism of my age were missed in school. But honestly, a label made to sound like a bad thing, it's not a tattoo on their forehead. You don't have to tell anyone if you don't want to. If you just want to keep that information to yourself, that's fine. But when you've got that understanding, you've at least got that diagnosis, you can access the help if you need it. And if you don't want to tell anyone, don't. That's your choice. But your child will have that understanding of themselves, the way their own mind works. The way I explain it to my children is that everyone struggles with something and everyone's struggles are different. Some people are just really, really shy, and that's a big struggle and a big challenge. But if they don't have any other assessments or diagnosis of anything, then that's not anything they have any help with. Some people really, really struggle with maths, and I know my children don't. So they almost find it difficult to understand how anyone would struggle with maths. It's like, yeah, but some people do. Some people struggle with reading. You don't. Not to say that all people with autism don't struggle with maths or reading, just my specific children don't. So I say, look, some people struggle with this, you don't. However, you struggle with cueing, and a lot of people don't. Or you struggle if your routine changes, a lot of people don't. You might struggle if it's a different type of day in school and the school day is not going to look the same, or you've got to wear something different and other people don't. So everybody struggles with something, and autism just describes your specific list of struggles. Another thing that I saw, which I think it was about ADHD in women, but I think it can apply a lot. It was something about I'd spent my whole life thinking I was a weird horse. When I realised I was just a zebra, not a weird looking horse, it made me feel so much better, and I stopped trying to be a horse and just realised I was a zebra and that was okay. Okay, I'm paraphrasing, and I think it was probably said a lot better than that, but the gist of it is realising you're not just weird, but this is just the way your particular mind works, which might be different to the way some other people's mind works, and that's okay, is massive. Some parents are really put off by the whole process and just the overwhelm, which I get, because it can feel like a lot, and I'm sure you've seen a lot online about people going through battles and battles and battles for their children, trying to get schools to listen, trying to get them assessed. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's daunting and it's not much fun. But what is potentially worse is dealing with the mental health fallout from children that are undiagnosed. And this is such a common story. Teenagers that are undiagnosed, and then puberty hits and everything gets a lot more difficult. And on top of dealing with puberty, they're dealing with why they don't feel like they don't fit in, feel like no one gets them, feel like they don't understand the world, why the world doesn't understand them. And having that understanding, it's like, I'm not weird, this is just the way my brain works, can really help there. So while, the idea of having to deal with all this is overwhelming, ultimately, you might end up dealing with a lot more extreme, potentially mental health challenges on top of the types of challenges you deal with now if your child does in fact have autism and they don't get any help or support. And a lot of people, hands up if you've experienced this, experience sort of very negative messaging from friends and family who are, said with love, uneducated about this stuff. Who's ever heard, oh, he doesn't look like he's autistic, or oh, I don't know why you're making such a fuss, or seems fine, or oh, you've probably just caused this by the way you're parenting him. Yep, I heard that one before my first child was assessed, that it was all my fault. Anyway, dealing with this judgment from others may deter some parents from actually seeking a formal assessment, but please don't let it. Ultimately, it's your child, you know your child. Just because other people don't see things in the few minutes every day or week or month that they see your child doesn't mean that the things you're seeing are not there. Do not allow anyone to gaslight you into thinking it's all in your head if you're actually witnessing your child struggle. Like I said, mostly when people ask me the question, I'm concerned about my child, I wonder if they may have autism, should I get them assessed? 99.9% of the time, my answer is, if you have enough concerns to ask me that question, if you have enough concerns to be Googling it, if the school have enough concerns that they've raised it with you, at very least, you need to get your child's name down on the waiting list. Now, the way you need to see this is just joining the waiting list is not the same even as getting the assessment or getting the diagnosis. Adding your child's name to the waiting list, sadly, probably means you are still years off actually getting your child assessed. Ultimately, if you put your child's name down today and in a couple of years' time, you get a letter or a phone call from the school saying, okay, they've come to the top of the list and it's time to get them assessed, you will probably have one of two responses. Either, turns out the signs that I was kind of worried about, I don't notice any of them anymore, and honestly, I have zero concerns. Things that I thought I witnessed have pretty much not happened at all since. I have zero concerns, please give the spot to someone else. That is always an option to say. Or you might be saying, Oh my goodness, thank goodness I put their names down, because the challenges we were facing back then have changed or been exacerbated or got more or shifted, but we are ultimately still dealing with challenges, and thank goodness I put my child's name down. So my advice is generally, if you are asking me that question, if you are worried enough to Google it, then yes, you should very least put your child's name down on the waiting list. And that way you don't have to really make any decisions. It's not a decision until the time comes for assessment. And even then, if you're in two minds, should you go ahead with it or not, if you have any doubts at all, go ahead and get your child assessed. Having witnessed autism assessments firsthand and sat through the one-way glass and watched them, they're so in-depth. I honestly do not believe that anyone without autism would ever be given a diagnosis. So another concern I hear a lot is, oh, what if they're falsely diagnosed? I don't personally believe that that is something that they would end up doing. The process is very, very thorough. Would someone with autism not necessarily make it through to assessment because they've been sieved out through filters where they're trying to kind of slim down the system a bit, and perhaps not enough behaviour has been witnessed by schools or doctors or whatever, not the same kind of level of things that you see at home? Would some children slip through the net, need an assessment, and not get one? Yes. And if you watch my previous vlogs where our youngest daughter was supposed to be being assessed and they didn't want to assess her, and then I fought really, really hard, and then it turns out she had an assessment and she was diagnosed, and she obviously does have autism, and I'm so glad I fought for that. Then yeah, people can absolutely slip through the net. But I don't believe that if you put a neurotypical child through an autism assessment, they would come out with a diagnosis. If you have any doubt, if you have any niggling feeling, chat to your GP, speak to your school. It does depend area by area in the UK exactly what the pathway looks like, and it depends how old your child is. As a rule of thumb, children under 5 are dealt with by the GP and the NHS. School-age children go through the school, the educational psychologists, and then are dealt with that way. And that system's generally very slow and clunky, but again, it depends where you are in the country. And then adults, so anyone over the age of 18, would go back through the NHS. But please do speak to your own school GP for guidelines for the pathway in your specific area and for any updates to the system since this video was filmed. So let me know down in the comments, which signs or symptoms have you noticed in your child, and where are you on the journey? Have you got children that you're wondering if they need to be assessed? Are you on the very long waiting list? How long have you been on that waiting list? Are they in the process of doing the assessments, or have you got a child that has been through an assessment and did they get a diagnosis or not? Share your experiences down in the comments. I think it's nice for us to be able to have a bit of community, learn from each other and support each other. I think that's really, really important. We do have discussions about all this kind of thing over in my Patreon as well, which is my community. There are paid for tiers where you get extra perks and early release videos and extra printables and things like that. But there's also a free tier that you can join in and just join the chat. So that's a really beautiful, loving, supportive community in there. So please do join me over there. Make sure that you get your printable checklist, the 100 signs of autism. I'll put the details for that and everything else I've mentioned down in the description and also in the blog post that goes with this video. So there's a playlist on screen that follows along the autism diagnosis journeys for my children. So you can see my exact experience, the whole roller coaster that was, and another video on screen that I know you'll find helpful. So click over there, check out my Patreon. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.